4 days. That's how much time is left before the trade deadline arrives, and right now, the two men most responsible for shaping this Yankees roster are facing louder public criticism than almost any point earlier this season. One offhand comment about quiet conversations turned into a genuine controversy. A pattern of unwavering loyalty is being questioned by a fan base that's running out of patience. And with the deadline bearing down, every single decision Brian Cashman and Aaron Boone make over these next few days is going to be scrutinized like almost nothing else this organization has faced all year. Here's the full story of why Cashman and Boone are under fire right now, and what's actually at stake before that deadline hits. Quick hello if you're new here. This channel breaks down the real stories behind baseball's biggest headlines, grounded in what's actually been reported. If you want more breakdowns like this one, go ahead and subscribe right now, because this Yankees front office is facing genuine pressure heading into one of the most consequential stretches of their entire season. Let's get into it. Let's start with the comment that set off this most recent wave of criticism, because the specific wording matters here, and the context surrounding when it was said matters just as much. This past Saturday, Aaron Boone was asked about the state of his ongoing conversations with general manager Brian Cashman regarding potential trade targets ahead of the deadline, a routine question reporters ask managers constantly during this exact stretch of the calendar every single season. His answer, relayed by MLB.com's Brian Hawk, was a literary reference that immediately raised eyebrows across the fan base rather than the routine, forgettable soundbite most managers give in response to that kind of question. All is quiet on the Western Front, Boone said, invoking the title of the classic World War I novel to summarize where things currently stood. He added that several clubs around the league were still deciding whether they'd be buyers or sellers with the deadline just over a week away at that point, suggesting a broader market-wide standstill rather than anything specific to New York's own situation. And New York Daily News reporter Gary Phillips independently confirmed the same exchange in his own dispatch, noting that same buyer-seller uncertainty gripping plenty of other organizations around the league at this exact point in the calendar. On its face, that's a fairly harmless, almost clever way for a manager to acknowledge a stalled trade market without tipping his hand about which specific targets might actually be closest to happening, the kind of literary flourish that might have simply generated a few amused reactions in a calmer moment for this fan base. But the reaction from Yankees fans was immediate, and considerably less charitable than Boone probably anticipated when he chose that particular phrasing. A fan account called the Yankee Report recirculated the quote almost immediately, crediting Hawk's original reporting, and it spread quickly enough on social media that what should have been a minor, forgettable exchange turned into a genuine flashpoint within hours. According to reporting on the fallout, plenty of fans directed real frustration at the front office in response, with one fan writing plainly that both Boone and Cashman need to be out of the organization by winter, and another dismissing both men in considerably harsher terms as talents who are simply running out the clock on a genuinely contending roster. That's a pointed, personal level of criticism, and it reflects something deeper than just one offhand quote about quiet trade conversations. It reflects months of accumulated frustration from a fan base that's watched this same front office leadership duo operate through good stretches and bad ones for years now, without much visible change in how either man communicates publicly about the state of the team, regardless of how the roster itself has actually performed in any given stretch. To understand why that specific quote landed so hard, you have to understand the position New York actually finds itself in heading into this deadline. The Yankees enter this stretch sitting at 61 wins and 46 losses, holding the top American League wild card position, with the Tampa Bay Rays leading the AL East at 62 and 44, meaning New York sits close enough to first place that a quiet, passive approach to the deadline feels genuinely frustrating to a fan base that believes this roster is built to compete for the division outright, not just to sneak into the playoffs through a wild card spot. At the same time, the gap isn't so large that Cashman can afford to overpay recklessly for short-term help either, leaving him genuinely caught in one of the more difficult middle ground positions a general manager can occupy this close to a deadline. Boone's phrasing let him acknowledge that stalled market reality without actually committing to anything specific, but for a fan base already primed to be skeptical of this front office's approach to deadlines, that kind of deliberately vague answer read less like careful messaging and more like another example of a leadership group unwilling to fully level with the people who watch this team every single night. This isn't actually the first time this exact dynamic has played out this season either, and understanding that pattern helps explain why fans reacted to Boone's comment with so much accumulated frustration rather than simply shrugging it off as one offhand remark. Back in late March, during a genuinely difficult stretch that saw the Yankees tumble down the American League standings after a promising start to the season, Cashman was asked directly about Boone's job performance. According to Yankees insider Chris Kirschner, Cashman told reporters before a game against the Tampa Bay Rays that he believed Boone does a great job, and when pressed on what specifically he continued to see in Boone that reinforced that confidence, Cashman didn't hesitate, saying it was nothing different than what he'd always seen in him. That kind of unwavering, unchanged support, delivered in the middle of a genuinely rough patch, is exactly the sort of comment that fans have heard from this organization for years now, and it created its own wave of frustration back in March, with critics arguing that instead of acknowledging real, specific areas needing improvement, Cashman simply repeated the same defense of his manager that supporters have grown tired of hearing regardless of how the team is actually performing on the field. That pattern of loyalty isn't new to this particular season either, and it's worth understanding the broader history here to see just how consistently this exact dynamic has repeated itself. Cashman has defended Boone through previous difficult stretches too, at one point acknowledging publicly that it would be easy from his position as general manager to make a decision that would simply satisfy an angry fan base, but that the real challenge lies in sticking with the personnel he genuinely believes in and working through difficult stretches together rather than making reactive changes under pressure. He's also been notably willing to accept responsibility himself when results haven't matched expectations, saying directly in one earlier instance that the people working under him were putting in real effort and were genuinely good at their jobs, and that when results don't follow, that responsibility falls on him as the head of baseball operations more than it does on the people executing his vision underneath him. That's a genuinely admirable, accountability-focused way to frame organizational failure, and it's worth giving Cashman real credit for consistently taking that position rather than deflecting blame onto players or coaching staff beneath him. But for fans who've heard variations of that same message repeated across multiple difficult stretches over multiple seasons, without much visible change in outcomes, that kind of consistent messaging starts to feel less like genuine accountability and more like a practiced, well-worn talking point trotted out every time criticism starts building. It's also worth remembering that this isn't the first time Cashman's deadline approach specifically has drawn heavy criticism from people who cover this team closely and professionally, not just from frustrated fans venting on social media. Back in a previous deadline stretch, as the Yankees faced a similar buy or sell decision with a roster that many around the league considered underperforming relative to its actual talent level and payroll, Cashman's front office ultimately chose to remain relatively inactive, while several American League rivals added significant, impactful talent before the deadline passed. According to reporting from The Athletic's Chris Kirschner at the time, that approach represented a genuine failure by Cashman and the front office, with Kirschner and a colleague going as far as assigning that deadline an outright failing grade, describing it as a disaster driven by a front office that showed little clear direction and failed to meaningfully solidify the roster heading into the following season. That's not fan frustration. That's a respected, well-sourced insider delivering a genuinely harsh professional assessment of Cashman's deadline decision-making, And it's exactly the kind of historical precedent that makes this current stretch of criticism land with extra weight, because it suggests this isn't simply an isolated moment of fan impatience, but part of a recurring pattern some critics believe defines Cashman's approach to these exact high-pressure moments. So what's actually at stake as this specific deadline approaches on August 3rd? New York has real, legitimate needs to address, needs that have only grown more urgent given the injury situation this roster has dealt with for months now. The team has been missing reigning MVP Aaron Judge since late May with a rib injury, has dealt with recurring calf issues sidelining Giancarlo Stanton for extended stretches, and just added Cody Bellinger to that injury list too, after a hamstring strain landed him on the injured list right before this exact stretch of games. That's an unusual amount of sustained adversity at some of the roster's most important offensive positions, and it's exactly the kind of situation that raises the stakes on every single deadline decision Cashman makes over these next few days. Since the margin for error on a roster already missing multiple key contributors is considerably thinner than it would be for a fully healthy team sitting in a similar position in the standings. There's also a fair, balanced counterpoint worth including here, because it would be misleading to present this entire situation as though Cashman and Boone have done nothing right this season or deserve nothing but criticism heading into this deadline. Cashman himself has acknowledged directly that he's currently approaching this deadline as a buyer, having real conversations with other clubs about possible deals before the market fully resolves itself, while also being honest that at a certain point, if the team's overall trajectory changed dramatically, he'd need to reconsider that stance and at least contemplate selling instead. That's a genuinely honest, transparent way to frame a general manager's actual decision-making process, even if it doesn't fully satisfy fans who simply want concrete moves made immediately rather than measured, patient explanations of the process behind those moves. And it's worth remembering that this current Yankees roster, even without Judge, Stanton, and now Bellinger all healthy at the same time, has still managed to hold the top wild card position in the American League. A genuinely impressive outcome given how much sustained injury adversity this team has actually navigated across the first 4 months of this season. That tension between real, earned criticism of a front office's communication style and pattern of loyalty, and a genuinely fair acknowledgement of the actual results this roster has produced despite significant obstacles, is exactly what makes this current moment so difficult to fully resolve one way or the other. Boone's own history backs up at least part of his side of this argument too. When Yankees legends Derek Jeter and Alex Rodriguez publicly criticized the team and specifically questioned where the accountability was during an earlier rough stretch last season, Boone responded directly rather than deflecting, acknowledging openly that criticism comes with the territory of managing an organization with this much history and this many expectations, while also pushing back gently on the specific accountability framing, arguing that his team stays focused daily on being the best version of itself regardless of how any individual stretch of games actually plays out in the standings. That's a manager who's shown, across multiple separate incidents now, a willingness to engage directly with tough questions rather than simply hiding behind vague, dismissive answers, even if his specific choice of words this past Saturday clearly didn't land the way he probably intended it to with an already skeptical fan base. So where does this actually leave the Yankees heading into the final days before the deadline arrives? Cashman and Boone remain firmly in their positions, and it's worth being clear that despite the intensity of this current criticism, there's essentially no realistic scenario where either man gets removed from his role mid-season, since this organization has a long-established pattern of not making major staffing changes while games are still being played, regardless of how loud outside criticism becomes at any given moment. What's genuinely uncertain is exactly what moves Cashman actually makes over these next several days, whether he leans into aggressively addressing the outfield need created by Bellinger's injury, whether he sticks with an earlier infield-focused strategy built around potential targets like Washington's C.J. Abrams, or whether he ultimately decides the safest path forward is simply riding out this deadline with the roster largely as currently constructed, trusting internal options and an eventual healthy return from Judge to carry this team through the stretch run instead. Whatever direction Cashman ultimately chooses, the surrounding noise around both him and Boone isn't likely to quiet down anytime soon, especially with a fan base that's clearly reached a genuine breaking point in terms of patience with vague, deflecting public comments about the team's actual plans. Every single move, and just as importantly, every move that doesn't happen before that August 3rd deadline passes, is going to get measured against this exact backdrop of accumulated criticism and skepticism. If Cashman makes a genuinely impactful addition before the deadline hits, some of this pressure likely eases, at least temporarily, replaced by cautious optimism about the roster's actual playoff chances. If the deadline passes with only modest, incremental moves, the criticism currently building around both Cashman and Boone is almost certainly going to intensify even further, adding yet another difficult chapter to an already complicated, contentious relationship between this front office and an increasingly impatient fan base that's watched this exact pattern play out across multiple seasons now. That's the full story behind the criticism currently surrounding Brian Cashman and Aaron Boone as the trade deadline bears down on this Yankees roster. A literary quote that landed harder than intended, a well-documented pattern of loyalty that some fans have grown tired of hearing, and a genuinely difficult set of roster decisions still sitting unresolved with just days remaining before the deadline arrives for good. Keep watching this one closely over these next several days, because whatever Cashman ultimately decides is going to shape not just the rest of this season, but likely the tone of this entire ongoing conversation about his and Boone's future with this organization for months to come. This video is created for entertainment and informational purposes only. All information discussed is based on publicly available reports, interviews, and statements from credible sports media sources, and reflects ongoing developments that may change over time. Nothing in this video should be taken as confirmed fact beyond what has been publicly reported, and no claims are made about the private motivations or beliefs of any individual mentioned. Warning disclaimer: this video is created for entertainment and informational purposes only. Opinions and commentary are based on publicly available information, reports, and statements from credible sources, and reflect ongoing developments that may change over time. This is not an official statement from the New York Yankees, MLB, or any individual mentioned.